All right, welcome to the first ever episode of Fantasy Football to the Max. I am your host, Randy Isbelle, and some of you may have heard me on another W2M football podcast, Football to the Max. I know it took us months to come up with this title, but I'm not alone. I am here with a good friend and a former coworker who you've also heard on that football podcast from time to time, Mike Mitchell. How are you, sir?
I am doing great, Randy, and on behalf of Americans everywhere, welcome back to the NFL season.
Oh, it is so exciting. It is the start of week 2 of the preseason as we speak. Mike, I don't know if you're like me, that you're excited for football, but you can't really sit down and watch a whole preseason game like me.
Well, to be honest, I can sit down and watch my team play an entire preseason game, but I do have a hard time watching preseason games of teams I care a lot less about. I guess I kind of watched the first half, to be honest, just to see, who's going to be slotted where and who's going to be vying for those positions that are still kind of up for grabs. But the second half gets a little difficult to watch when the level of play drops.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I'm a Jets fan. Full disclosure, and I can watch the Jets game, no problem, but doing the preseason game reviews for the other football podcast got a little rough trying to watch the fourth quarter of some of those games. But that's not what we're here for. We're here for the fantasy aspect of this, which is just taking the world by storm. It's almost more popular than the game itself. And we're going to be here throughout the season every Monday and Thursday, breaking down all of the games, giving you waiver wire pickups. Everything that you need to know you can get here, but it is a few weeks before the season, so it is time to get ready for those drafts. And what better way to get ready for those drafts than just kind of explain to everybody how we feel when we go into a draft, what our ideas are, what our philosophies are, so you know where we're coming from when the next few weeks come by and we start breaking down all these rankings. So Mike, this year, much different than most. I mean, how many years straight has it been where all you've heard is take running back first, like the first 8, 9, 10 picks are always running backs? This year, most experts say top 2 or 3 picks are wide receivers. Are you going that same route?
Well, to be honest, I am in a league with you, and I don't have to necessarily be too concerned with it since I'm drafting 11th. However, it's very interesting when you look at it, because this is unprecedented. We haven't seen wide receivers ranked this high ever in the history of fantasy football. This is literally the first time that you could find 12 out of the first 20 picks are wide receivers, including in some places the top 2 or even 3 are looked at as being the top 3 choices. So it's going to be a very, very interesting draft this year, and I think that's probably going to be the case across the board for everybody who plays fantasy football. It's going to be a unique, and really it's going to be an exciting draft, I think. This might be the most exciting draft I can ever remember.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at it, and you probably come in with 6 or 7 different philosophies going into a draft of where different positions are going to be picked up. What are you going to take late? How late do you wait for a quarterback? Some people don't wait to get their defenses and kickers. But usually those philosophies start changing, about the 5th round pick and down. This year it's from the word go. You're going to have so many different people trying different things. Still going with the running back start that has been the norm for many years. There's going to be lots of people that don't even take a running back in the first 2 rounds. And then it's how late do you wait to take a quarterback? I've seen some sites say go for it in the 2nd round. I've seen other sites say not to the 4th round. So it's going to be a lot different, but I just have to ask you, what do you think the difference is? Why the big shift? Is it's just that much more of a passing league now, or is it because most running backs are now in a committee, so it takes away from some of their touches? What do you think has caused this big change?
Well, I think you hit on a couple good points right there. I mean, you're looking at a league that has committees in the majority of the backfields now. So it's a lot harder to pick a running back in the earlier rounds that's going to return the value that you can get from a wide receiver. And you look at the wide receivers, the number one wide receiver on each team is generally putting up some really huge numbers, which is why they're ranked so high. And even, through double teams, through different schemes, these guys like Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, Julio Jones are putting up unprecedented receiver numbers. So it's hard to pass on that many fantasy points that these guys are offering in order to take a running back who's going to produce less in the long run. So with that in mind, unless you get a guy who you can be absolutely certain is going to get the majority of carries, it makes the running back position a really difficult one to gauge as far as where you should draft different players.
Yeah, do you think it's more just a risk-reward kind of a situation now as more and more running backs seem to not be able to play all 16 games?
I think that's part of it. Look at a guy, for example, we'll say Jamal Charles. Mm-hmm. Jamal Charles is clearly one of the best running backs in the NFL when he's healthy, but he's had 2 season-ending injuries now, and if you lose a guy for the season, especially if you take him in the first round, that can be a critical loss to your team. I don't know how many fantasy players know this, or even if you know this, Randy, but the top 4 positions that you draft in your fantasy draft generally account for nearly 50% of the points that you'll score in a fantasy league in the season. So if you lose one of those players for the season, that's a pretty big hit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and that's where we'll kind of start with some of our philosophies as far as how we look at things, and we'll start with those injury concerns. Say you have Jamal Charles on the board. You were talking about it earlier. We're in a league where I'm actually 10th and you're 11th. How far down do you let Jamal Charles slip with those injury concerns before you go ahead and pull that trigger?
Well, in my personal experience, I prefer to draft in a reactionary sort of way, meaning that, I kind of respond to the draft based on how other people are drafting. Mm-hmm. So if there's a huge run of running backs that go in front of me, it's going to be hard to make a case for myself to take the 11th best running back at the 11th pick if 10 running backs have gone ahead of me, because I know there's so much value elsewhere. And the thing is, yes, you can get some great players with injury concerns, but then you're forced to make sure that you handcuff them later on in the draft. So, at what point do you take them as a handcuff? You're probably going to lean towards taking them around earlier than you'd like to because you don't want someone else to pick them up.
Yeah.
So it really throws off your draft a little bit when you take guys that are going to have to be handcuffed because of their risk.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point about how when you're in a draft and you see a run of players going, I know a lot of people then feel obligated that they have to continue that run. I'm with you. I'm the opposite. You see a run of a position, unless there's that standout guy that I absolutely want. Say it is a Jamal Charles. Say there was a run of 8 or 9 running backs right off the bat, and Jamal Charles is sitting there. At that point, I'm going wide receiver. I'm going the opposite direction because I know that this run of players has allowed a really good player to drop into my lap. And to me, it would probably be safer as well. I kind of lean away from the big injury risks. Sometimes, people get a little scared off over nothing just because, to be honest, how much more are you worried about Jamal Charles getting hurt than an Adrian Peterson when all it takes is one play and both of them could be out? Injury history is one thing, but at times we use it too much as a crutch. But it's interesting to see where people go. Some people won't care at all, and they're going to end up taking him, the 5th or 6th pick. Some people won't draft him at all till late in the 2nd round, which, of course, most likely he will be gone. So what about players like a Jordy Nelson or a Kelvin Benjamin who missed all of last year and, come back? do you wait on them? Do you think they're going to be sleepers for you later on? Those are the type of players that to me are so tough to figure out because they're so talented, but they've been away for so long. How are they going to be reacclimated into the offense?
Yeah, well, for example, you said Jordy Nelson. It's hard to pass on the value that Jordy Nelson brings to team. When you look at the numbers that he put up, and also when you factor in that he has one of the best quarterbacks in the league throwing the ball to him, I mean, that's one of those things where I think you almost have to roll the dice. If he's sitting there in a place that he shouldn't be sitting there because people are passing on him, again, like you said about the injuries, yes, every player is susceptible to injury at any point on any play. But it's hard to pass on the value that a player of his caliber brings, especially for the offense that he plays for, So I kind of like to factor that in too. Here's a guy with some injury risk, but he's also on an offense that is going to showcase his talents. So he's going to bring, a really good return as long as he stays healthy. But, if you're taking a team full of guys with injury risk, obviously you're taking a pretty big risk yourself. So it's nice to be able to sprinkle in some of the more reliable players along the ways. But as far as value is concerned, I don't think you can pass on certain value even if there is an injury risk involved.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And it's going to be interesting to see how these players fall in all of these drafts, and I'm curious what other people think as well. So definitely leave comments underneath the podcast as far as, if you want to disagree with us, agree with us, throw in your own points. We very much welcome that. But I want to jump into real quick just like an overall draft formula, if you have one. Are you the type of player that is taking multiple quarterbacks, multiple defenses, multiple tight ends, or are you just one and done on those? How do you feel about structuring a team coming out of a draft?
Well, that's kind of changed over the years, and a lot of that is based on, this season is a perfect example of how much value different players are bringing now from different positions. Case in point, the wide receivers being ranked so much higher. I should throw in this little story real quick. My very first ever fantasy football draft, the first player I ever drafted in fantasy football, I admit this, but I think it's kind of funny, was Vinny Testaverde. Number 1 draft pick in 1999, my first season ever playing fantasy football. What happened to Vinny Testaverde in week 1? Jets fan? He blew out his ACL.
We don't talk about that.
So when you consider that's the luck that I had to start my season at this point, to start my hobby of fantasy football. However, I fixed it pretty nicely. I picked up a guy named Kurt Warner off of waivers who went undrafted that season, and he went on to throw over 40 touchdowns and over 4,000 yards. So not only was he phenomenal, but he was far better than I ever could have hoped I would have gotten from Vinny Testaverde. So that's a little story about my initial foray into the fantasy football world. But back to the original topic, I think my draft strategy a lot of times, as I stated, is kind of reactionary. What are people targeting? Because there's almost always a case, especially with you and I drafting down near the bottom of the draft, where there is a run of players and you're going to find some value somewhere, whether it's, do you take a chance on a Rob Gronkowski maybe down where we're sitting? He's the best tight end in the league. You're getting value out of a player like him because his point production is 2 or 3 points better than the next best player at his position. Or do people stick with the old school version, which actually was kind of what I adopted when I first started playing fantasy football, of making sure you secure a couple of solid running backs to start the season? My philosophy now is I take the best value at the position I'm drafting at. If there's a guy that should have been taken 6th or 7th and he fell all the way to me, I'm probably taking him because I want that value there, and I find that I can remedy any weird situations. Our league, for example, is very running back heavy. We have people in our league that love to draft running backs. There's been cases where the first 30 picks, 20 of them are running backs, and by the third or fourth round, there's hardly anybody left. Last season, I think I had Melvin Gordon and Devontae Freeman as my first 2 picks, which going into the season, there was more expectations for Gordon than there was for Freeman, but as it turns out, Devontae Freeman ended up being a stud and Gordon ended up being a bust. But it worked out okay for me, even though I gambled and waited so long on running backs. I did end up winning the league last season, which was pretty fortunate, because of a guy like a Devontae Freeman. So if you do pass on those popular positions like running backs, you're going to have to take some chances later on in the draft on guys that you're not really sure of. And for me, the logic behind taking a Devontae Freeman was he was an unproven commodity, as was Tevin Coleman behind him. You didn't really know what you would get there. So I looked at it as, hey, this is a boom or bust situation here. And I think there's certainly an opportunity for one of these guys to be outstanding, or maybe they're both busts. But it turned out that my gamble paid off.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up the question was, to me, my draft philosophy as far as forming my team is, obviously you only take one kicker, and you take him in the very last pick. If you don't do that, stop it. Kicker goes last. It's period.
Couldn't agree more.
I'm also one of the people that usually will wait and pick my defense, my second to last pick. Sometimes when I'm feeling a little frisky or I feel like, my team has formed itself pretty well, I'll use the last 2 picks to get 2 defenses and then just kind of play the matchup game. But usually, unless your league is very deep, you're going to find a few defenses on the waiver wire that, will fit your need when needed. I'm also usually just a one tight end kind of a guy. Again, you can find people to fill in, and if you do get injuries, you're going to be able to trade for somebody that ends up with 2 tight ends or whatever. So I'm usually just one of each of those positions. And then to me, it comes down whether I take 1 or 2 quarterbacks. I usually only take the one, but this year, with it being so interesting, I'm almost tempted to just wait until the 9th, 10th, 11th round and then take back-to-back quarterbacks and play the matchups that way. And then everything else is running back and wide receiver. For the exact point that you brought up where, you took a gamble on Freeman and it very much paid off. And that's the whole point is, you just fill your roster full of high upside guys. The guys that most likely are going to just not do anything, but they have that slight chance that if given the opportunity, they could run with it, pardon the pun, and get you 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns and be that steal of the draft. I fill my team late with just a bunch of those sleeper pick possibilities, if you would.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good philosophy to have, and for a lot of the more veteran fantasy league players, I think a lot of us kind of have adopted that strategy too for the later rounds. As I stated before, those first 4 picks are critical to establishing a solid core of points that you can rely on every week. And then after those first 4 picks, there might be a couple more guys that you can definitely rely on. But at some point, you're going to have to plug and play. Whether it's a flex, whether it's wide receiver 2. Mm-hmm. A lot of those come down to just matchups. And you brought up a good point on quarterbacks. Once you get past the Cam Newtons and the Aaron Rodgers and maybe the Luck and Wilsons, then you're kind of rolling the dice a little bit on what expectations you can have, because there really is a group of about 10 to 12 quarterbacks who all are kind of bunched in that same location as far as their expectations. So it does come down to a matchup situation. If you don't get one of those top 4 QBs, I think your strategy of picking 2 later on and just kind of playing, based on what defense is struggling. You got one guy playing, for example, we'll pick on the Browns because, well, they kind of pick on themselves, but you got a guy playing the Browns and you got a guy playing the Broncos, your decision's made for you. So It's not a bad strategy to have. And there's always the chance that one of those guys has a tremendous breakout season, even better than, the expectations that we have for him. So there's value in that as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, the way you say it, and we will hit on it all season long. Play the matchups. Obviously, don't sit your studs. Don't get too crazy with it. Don't end up like benching Cam Newton because Matthew Stafford's playing the Browns or something silly like that. But I mean, definitely, especially for like the flexes or, as you said, the wide receiver twos or running back twos, you can mess around with matchups a little bit and try to find that hidden gem each week. But that brings me to bye weeks. I hear a lot of people that during drafts, and you've been there for them too, that decide to draft one player over the other because they had already drafted somebody earlier that already has the same bye week. Do you fall in that philosophy, or do bye weeks even matter to you?
I pay attention to bye weeks. I put them down on paper. I'm not too worried about having maybe two guys, even three to some extent, on the same bye week. If you're looking at 4 or more, then maybe it could be a concern. And if you get in a situation like that, one of the most important things I think in fantasy football is you should always be one step ahead of the draft position you're in. So, for example, you should, if you can. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way because, as we both know, since we've drafted next to each other, what is this, season 3 now?
Yeah, it's
a guy gets picked that you expected to be there, and now all of a sudden he's taken in front of you, and you got to do a little bit of searching. But if you can think ahead a little bit, find 2 or 3 guys that you can pick from if you do get into a bye week crunch. I don't think you should look at it too much because it's hard to pass on a guy who you expect to perform a lot better than another guy just because he's going to have that week off. And that brings us to the waiver wire. If you're not active on the waiver wire, you're not going to win in fantasy football, guys. Just to let you guys know, that's an important piece of information, and a lot of new players, they want to save. If you're in a money league, they want to save that extra dollar. They don't want to spend the money, but you know what? You spent the money to get in the league. Why wouldn't you spend the money to keep your team, competitive and give yourself a chance?
Yeah.
So if you get in a bye week crunch like that, then you can always fix it in the waivers.
Yeah,
and
that's why
maybe your team.
I was just gonna say that's why I don't even
team
worry
takes
about.
A hit.
Go ahead.
Maybe your team takes a hit for 1 week because you're playing, a couple guys that you might not want to start normally, but as it stands, do you want the best team or do you want to have a down week along the season?
Yeah, that's why I don't even really worry about bye weeks that much. Like I'll keep an eye on it, but for the same reason, I'm big on the waiver wire. I love making trades in the season as well. To me, that's just the more fun part of fantasy football is negotiating a trade and trying to work a deal and kind of fix the holes that you have throughout the season. But the NFL season is such a moving process that you can't look at it and go, well, I can't have these 2 players that both have a Week 10 bye week. Well, who says that both of them are going to be on your team on Week 10? Who says they're both going to be healthy on Week 10? So, to me, unless it's like I have 4 guys that are on bye week 4 or something, like it's really early on in the season, I don't care because my team changes constantly. I mean, a couple weeks ago when you and I got together and we're kind of discussing the podcast and we went back and we're looking at last year's draft for this league that we keep talking about, we talk about the first 4 picks being so important. My first 4 picks were awful. I had 2 guys injured and 1 guy that was just a complete bust and had to work the entire season, work in the waiver wire, work in the trades to put together enough of a team to just barely edge into the playoffs. So it's something to just remember. It's the draft is not the end game. It's the start, and you have all season to work on your team, improve your team, and hopefully not let it just sit there stagnant. Because, yes, the draft is very much important, but it's just the beginning. It's just lap 1 of this 500-lap race we have going on here. So just something to remember. And so we go through the bye weeks, and we've talked about injuries. But now I want to talk about, when do you reach? Are you the type of guy that we talked about how if you take a running back, you want to take that handcuff, one round earlier than you probably would have. Who's that player that you would reach for, like if you look at an ADP on a site, that 3-round jump? Is there any player out there right now that you would go, I have to make sure I have this type of player on my team?
As in a specific name?
Either name or
I
just.
think
or how about this? Would you, if say you have Andrew Luck on your team, would you reach a round or two earlier to get T.Y. Hilton and go for the double dip, or do you not care?
I think double dips, they're fun. Both of us have enjoyed double dips from time to time. Last year I had Brady and Gronkowski, even though, and this brings me to another point, and I know you accept this too. A lot of people don't like the Patriots, and you as a Jets fan, I'm sure, would agree with that logic. But in fantasy football, you cannot let your heart determine how you build your team. So, for example, Tom Brady is sitting there for me last season in round 5. It's hard for me to turn down a value play like that, especially when you consider the offseason he had with all of the tumultuous, Deflategate stuff. And we thought he might get suspended last season, but he managed to avoid it. So you're taking an angry Tom Brady. What better guy to double dip him with than with Rob Gronkowski? So that's a perfect case where me, as a Steeler fan, I don't really care all that much for the Patriots either. I respect their team. I think they're ran well. They're obviously a perennial Super Bowl contender. And here I am with Tom Brady and Rob Gronkowski. And it obviously paid off in the long run, but that's just one of those cases where you can't use your heart to determine how you draft your team. Mm-hmm. As far as what you were mentioning about reaching for guys, I am more inclined to reach for certain positions that might be overlooked. Let's say tight end, for example. I think there's a lot of tight ends that are kind of in a wash machine, for lack of, you can kind of reach in there, you can pull them out, and what do you get? And I think that's one of those perfect positions where there's probably 3 or 4 tight ends that I might have more value placed on than I see the normal ADPs going for, or even the rankings that are given by various sites. There's certain players at a position like that I give a little bit more credence to than the average fantasy football player or even the average fantasy football analyst. And I think it should also be said, we're talking about a standard league here too, folks. So, we might throw in some PPR nuggets here and there, but this is generally a discussion that pertains to standard football leagues only.
Yeah, if you guys have questions for any of that, or like for your type of league, go ahead and ask those questions, and we'll hit more of those, as we do the position breakdowns. But like I said, this podcast is just do kind of an intro and a basic philosophy, really, between us. So, I mean, you said double dips are fun, but how much is too much? Where do you draw the line? Say, we'll use Green Bay, for example. Say you have Aaron Rodgers and you got Eddie Lacy. Is it too much to then get like a Randall Cobb? When is it too many of one team on your fantasy team, or do you just not care if the offense is good enough?
It's too many when the offense isn't good enough. I mean, that's pretty much the way it goes. If you recall, we had a player in our fantasy league several years back who basically picked all of the Patriots and then proceeded to completely destroy our league until the Super Bowl, where she was finally defeated. And her being a coworker and it being, pretty much her rookie season, we had to hear about it every single week about how good this guy was and that guy was. And I got to be honest, she did absolutely crush us. And it's our own fault for letting her stock up that way. So, if an offense is completely dominant, which that Patriots club was dominant, then why not? If you got one guy at wide receiver 2 who's going to get you 10 touchdowns and say 1,200 yards, kind of like Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns last year, yes, where you've got 2 high production players, and you've got the quarterback. It doesn't matter where the points come from. The only drawback is obviously if that team has a bad week, you're going to have a bad week, and that's what happened to her in the Super Bowl. So that's certainly where the risk is having that team just lay an egg one week, because obviously you're kind of hitched to them at that point. But depending on how good a team is, you could take that risk. I personally don't like to have more than, say, 2 players at any one, and normally one of them would be a quarterback, and the other one might be wide receiver or running back. I don't like to have more than 2 because I don't like running that risk of having a team lay an egg. And if you draft a team in that way and that team ends up laying an egg and you don't have any prior knowledge to it, you're going to be stuck with 4 players on a team that's struggling. And that could be rough. Look at the Broncos last season. If you had Demaryius Thomas and Peyton Manning and you were stuck with their confusing running situation last season, yeah, it probably looked great going into the draft. Look at all these Broncos I got, and everybody's great here. But, obviously that defense was the best player on that team, and that offense really struggled because the quarterback position struggled. So it's certainly a risk, and one that I prefer to avoid beyond, say, quarterback in one other position.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you had to pick, since, again, we will get into the position ranks over the next couple weeks, but give me your top 3 offenses to target as far as fantasy-wise. Those teams that you go, well, this guy is like the 3rd wide receiver on this team, but it's this offense, so he's going to be productive. Who are those teams that you're just going to target based on the level of offense rather than the name of the player later in the draft?
Well, I think there's a couple that are kind of gray area, but two that come right off the top of my head are Green Bay and Arizona. And a lot of it we have to base on the fact that Jordy Nelson is coming back, and Aaron Rodgers did have a down season last year because he had a lot of receivers that were underperforming, and their offense line didn't play as expected. Eddie Lacy turned out to just be a complete bust. I expect Green Bay to have a bounce-back season this year, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Then you go over to Arizona, and that team is pretty well loaded. They've got 3 wide receivers, all of whom are, pretty similar in their productive capabilities. And as long as Carson Palmer stays healthy, that team's going to put up points. They did last season. There's no reason to expect them not to this season. So those 2 right off the top of my head. I think it'd be hard to not look at New England guys, but obviously you got to temper that a little bit because those first 4 weeks, Brady's going to be gone, and we don't know what we can expect out of Garoppolo. I mean, a backup quarterback's a backup quarterback no matter what team he's playing for. So that's one where, you can look at New England as being a definite high-scoring team, but you've got a third of the season lost for Brady, so there's a little bit of risk there.
Yeah, I think the other team that I would bring up, and a little knocked down with all the suspensions and stuff, but your Pittsburgh Steelers, I think, would be another team that later on in the draft, taking their 3rd or 4th wide receiver, maybe because of all these suspensions, they're going to get more looks and more targets and more yardage.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I kind of have Pittsburgh in that next tier kind of gray area. They could be amazing production, or they could be, mediocre production. Obviously, there's pieces in place. If Martavis Bryant was there, I think that really makes that offense just completely explosive. But even without him, they're still loaded. And then you look at a team like Cincinnati. You've got Dalton coming back, and they have a couple of pretty solid running backs there. They've got A.J. Green, obviously. So, you might be able to expect them to put up some numbers too. And then you have, I know, your Cinderella favorite, the Jacksonville Jaguars, which, that's right,
Yes.
the Jacksonville Jaguars. Randy thinks they're going to be much improved. I think they're going to be moderately improved, but the one thing we can definitely agree on is those two wide receivers in Jacksonville put up some points.
Yeah, and don't forget Julius Thomas, who came in middle of the season and really started to click with Blake Bortles. But I will say, I believe the team itself is going to be much improved. Fantasy-wise, I don't see it as much, maybe for Hearns and Robinson, but I hinder my expectations a little bit for Blake Bortles. And here's why, and it rolls perfectly into my next topic. But the Jacksonville Jaguars could have just renamed themselves last year to the Junk Time Jaguars, because that's what they were fantasy-wise. They would give you absolutely nothing for the first half, be down 21 points, and then just storm all the way back, get close to winning, sometimes win, sometimes lose. But the next thing you know, if you're owning Blake Bortles and one of those receivers, all of a sudden you just got 50 points. They were ridiculous as far as junk time goes, as far as getting you back into a game that you thought you had already lost because of how terrible they were in the first half. I don't see that as much this year because I think they're going to be more into games. I think the defense is going to improve. I think they're going to win a bit more. So that junk time point is going to go away a little bit. But that is my question. Who is this year's junk time Jaguars? Who's that team that you want to stash a few players knowing that they're going to have to throw the ball late and you can steal some easy points?
Well, I'll take one in the AFC and one in the NFC.
Perfect.
They both might surprise you. But give me Tennessee as my junk time AFC team.
I like it.
They've got DeMarco Murray now, and obviously, there's a little bit of a fight there for that running position. But you got to figure DeMarco's probably going to win the job at least coming into the season. And they have some quality wide receivers, and they've got Mariota with another year under his belt. And prior to him getting hurt last season, we started to see Mariota start to take some real steps as a dynamic quarterback, and I have to expect he's only going to get better this season. So that's kind of one of those sleeper teams that might surprise a few teams, but probably isn't going to get over the hump this year. But I think they've got some garbage time potential. In the NFC, I'll take the Detroit Lions, and I know Megatron's gone, a huge loss, but if you look at what Detroit did last season to close out season, they went 6-2 down the stretch. They started 1-7, and their running game was just a mess. And we don't know, is it going to be Theo Riddick? Is it going to be Amir Abdullah? Who's going to get the ball there? That's still kind of a question mark. But what they did do is they gave Stafford some opportunities to start throwing the ball, and they tried to improve their offensive line, and that's kind of the big question mark for them. And if they did improve that offensive line, you give Stafford some time, he'll burn you. He's got a good arm, and yes, he makes some mistakes. Every quarterback does, but I think a lot of his mistakes can be attributed to the fact that he just doesn't have time to throw the ball. So that's my NFC team that might be able to sneak up on some people, at the wide receiver position, and maybe put up some surprising fantasy league points playing from behind with a questionable defense.
Yeah, my team, I think I'm going to agree with you with Tennessee. I want to go way out on a limb and say Cleveland, but I can't. They have Josh Norman after a few games and Corey Coleman and us, I think, at the wide receiver core. And you never know if RG3 is going to stay healthy or not.
Right, and if they figure out the Crowell and Duke Johnson situation, you might actually have something there.
Yeah, it's just I would like to see them as a junk time, but I need to see more from them. The team that I think really jumps off the page to me, as far as that Jacksonville formula, you had the right division in the NFC, but I'm going with the Chicago Bears because I think they're going to get pretty beat up this year. I don't see them winning more than 4 or 5 games. And yes, Jay Cutler is an awful quarterback. However, if Alshon Jeffrey can stay healthy and he gets Kevin White back, who didn't get to play a down at all, but came into the league or into the season last year with all of the hype in the world. If you get that team down by 21 or more and they get to fling it around, at that point you're looking at some major yardage and some touchdowns out of those two.
Yeah, I think that's a good choice, and a lot of that we'll get to see that heads up twice, so that'll be kind of nice. I mean, which team takes the reins there, Detroit or Chicago? Maybe both teams put up 40. Who knows? But I think that's certainly a good choice too. And a lot of this can be decided just based on how bad of a defense these teams have. If you don't have much expectations for a team's defense, then you should be able to expect some garbage time points from their team offense.
Yeah. Now lead me to the next thing. How much do you care about your fantasy defense in a draft?
I think defense it's one of those things where a defense can win you fantasy games. They're kind of the sleeper of fantasy football. I mean, yeah, granted, every once in a while a kicker will kick 4 or 5 field goals and 2 of them 50 yards, and he gets slapped around by some kicker who scores 21 points. But if you have a defense that can go out and consistently give you 8 to 12 points, it makes a big difference in the end. The problem with defenses it's really hard to gauge how good a defense is going to be. In our league, for example, we don't play based on yardage allowed. We take just sacks, turnovers, stuff along those lines, and that's in touchdowns, obviously. And that's how we determine how a defense scores. And that's it's probably the most difficult position to predict on your fantasy roster is a defense. So I know you had mentioned that sometimes you take one defense, sometimes you take two defenses, and I agree that you should probably consider doing that late in the draft because we've seen, save maybe the Seahawks, who I think have gone 4 years straight now, allowing the fewest points. It really becomes a crapshoot after those first couple of defenses about who you should take. So there's some value to playing matchups with defenses that you think, and you kind of have to make those determinations on schedule and on your own expectations, as far as which defense you take. But I kind of am a fan in my own draft strategy of taking two defenses and playing the matchups to get the most value out of that position.
Yeah, and you bring up the Seahawks and those top tier defenses, and to me those are untouchable teams for me because, especially the Seahawks, because we live in the Northwest. The Seahawks end up going in like the 6th round, and just ridiculousness how high some of the top defenses go. So that's where my philosophy comes in. If you go in with the philosophy of us of wanting two defenses late, you could just start crossing off the Broncos and the Seahawks and the Cardinals right now. And then you start looking down at those middle-ranked teams, and then that's when you can kind of figure out what two teams that you want to have on your fantasy team as far as matchups go, whether it's the Rams or the Jets or the Bills or Dolphins or wherever you want to go with it, and just kind of work matchups. And that's how I like to do it as well. But with me, I usually will draft one and then pick up a second one early on in the year once I've realized one of the players I picked late is a complete bust.
Yeah, and that works, so long as someone else doesn't pick them before you. But I think I agree. You try to find some value at the defensive position, and that you certainly brought up an excellent point on the Seahawks. Depending on where people live. Unless you live in an area where your football team is a perennial, doghouse team, teams like the Seahawks have tremendous expectations in the Northwest every season, and people will certainly reach well beyond where they should be reaching in order to take, players or their defense from that team, just to have them on their team. And that kind of goes back to what I said. You can't play fantasy football with your heart. You got to play it with your head. And you've got to make the best pick at each position. And as far as defense is concerned, whether you do it your way, which is to take one defense and then pick one up later after you drop somebody, or you pick two, which I go either way. It depends. What's out there in round 14 or 15 that you didn't expect to see. Oh, you know what? maybe I should get a second tight end, or maybe there's a wide receiver that nobody's really paying attention that, might have some sleeper potential. Just kind of depends on what's still sitting there late. But I think either way probably works. You can take one and pick one up on waivers, or you can take two that you feel pretty good about in the draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we will be getting into in our next few drafts. And unless you have anything else, do you have any other philosophies you want to bring up, Mike?
Well, as far as the philosophies, I think we hit on the primary ones. If you're a new player to fantasy football, then do some research. Look at where people are putting different players, and in some cases, if you feel differently, maybe find out why those players are where they are. That gives you a lot more comfortability when you're actually going to a draft. And as like we said, with the first 4 rounds being so important, it's easy to draft early, but once you start getting down to rounds 7, 8, 9, 10, and beyond, suddenly you kind of have to know a thing or two about what you're doing. And so I kind of like to make sure people realize that those first 50 players or so, they're going to go in the first 50 slots for the most part. It might not be exactly where they're projected to go, but you should probably focus a lot more of your draft attention to what you do after those first 5 or 6 rounds. Really pay attention to guys that you want to pick up later in the draft, because it'll make it a lot easier for you to make decisions when draft day comes around.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be getting into all of those rankings of those sleeper picks and all these different positions over the next few weeks. Monday will be the first one when we hit the quarterback position, which is kind of a cluster going into the year as far as when you want to draft them, which ones you want to draft first, or do you want to wait and pick up a few later on. So we'll have some very interesting discussions when we get to that one. But until we get to that episode, I would like to thank you very much for joining the inaugural Fantasy Football to the Max podcast, and want to make sure that you check out all the other podcasts that we have on the W2M network. It continues to grow in amazing rates as we get new podcasts coming. I just saw they just added another new one, I want to say 2 days ago. So new podcasts are coming all the time, plus all the ones that you like. So if you're a sports fan, a video game guy, or a wrestling person, we got all sorts of podcasts for you. So check out the W2M page on Facebook and the upcoming website that will be kicking off here shortly. But until then, Mike and I will see you guys Monday night when we break down the quarterback position. Mike, thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And to all you listeners out there, I hope you're getting some good value out of this, and we will talk to you on Monday.
All right. Take care, guys.